Chapter 8: The Resurrection and the Life. Case Studies by States. They called it Ghana. One black state defied the slow onslaughts of the Sahara for over 2,000 years, hanging on to its fringes far into historic times, just as though it was determined to let the world actually see how all of its sister states in that vast wasteland had died. Furthermore, its very antiquity and the similarity of its advanced institutions to those of the Ethiopian Empire in the east has raised the question of whether it was a western outpost of that empire. There is, of course, no question about the travels of blacks between the eastern and western Sudan. The geographers were among the first foreigners to arrive in the region in the 10th century AD. The Arab and European practice of naming countries and peoples often displayed both ignorance and arrogance. They did not condescend to inquire of the people about the name of their country or the meaning of the titles they held. So they called this country Ghana, which meant the leader, head of the state, or in Western terms, the king. The people who migrated into the country from all directions had every reason to believe they were far enough into the interior to be free and secure at last in a kingdom that had never been conquered, either by the forces of nature or of men. And its history was long. As citizens, they could help in the further development of the general prosperity and the education which was an integral part of the national program. Ghana's actual history goes far back beyond its known record. That record listed 44 kings before the Christian era, and this alone would extend Ghana's known history beyond the 25th dynasty, when the last black pharaohs ruled Egypt, 7th century BC. Holding on and holding out against a slowly but steadily expanding ocean of sand, the now 3 million square miles of the Sahara Desert, it had nevertheless reached a high level of greatness in the 11th century and was an empire comparable to most European states at that time. It surpassed many others in social organization, military power, economic wealth, and in the promotion of higher education. This African empire had expanded territorially by both conquest and peaceful alliances with neighboring countries, including dependencies such as Sama, Garentel, Gadiaro, Galam, present-day northern Ghana area, Diara, Soso, and Tekrur. The desert tribes of Berbers were made tributaries. The Zenaga, Lemtuna, Gadala, Mesufa. The empire, known as the Land of Gold, became great not only because it controlled the greatest source of gold for both Europe and Asia, but also because of its iron mining and iron manufactures for over 1,000 years. Leadership in iron industry made her a dominant power over less progressive peoples in the Western Sudan. This mastery of iron also meant the development of a mighty military power, equipped with awesome weapons over which it had a monopoly. These weapons were heralded abroad, striking fear among neighboring states. Some were annexed without resistance, others had to be conquered. Control over caravan trade routes to the north, east, Ethiopia, and Egypt was probably the most important factor in the ever-growing wealth of the nation. There were import and export taxes, a system of weights and measures, and control of inflation by limiting the flow of gold. Kumbai, the capital, was a twin city of stone mansions, temples, mosques, and schools, along with the thatched roof huts of the masses. The larger towns and cities were generally located on or near lakes, rivers, and lesser streams such as creeks. The Niger was the most important river for trade, travel, and warboats. It was a mixed economy of agriculture: wheat, millet, cotton, corn, yams, cattle raising, cows, horses, goats, camels, and sheep. The iron industry, mining, and numerous crafts were organized as guilds: blacksmiths, goldsmiths, jewelers, coppersmiths, stone masons, brick masons, water diviners, carpenters, weavers, sandal makers, dyers, cabinet makers, furniture makers, and potters. The soil was more favorable for millet than wheat. Much wheat was imported. Other imports from African countries and abroad were salt, textiles, cowrie shells, brass, dates, figs, pearls, fruit, sugar, dried raisins, and honey. The chief exports were gold, ivory, rubber, and slaves. Under the Emperor Tenkamenin, the imperial army numbered 200,000, 1060, of which 100,000 were mounted and 40,000 were expertly trained bow and arrow brigades. It was not a standing army; rather it was somewhat like a national guard, trained and ready to answer the call when needed, but otherwise following their usual occupations. The most famous schools were at Kumbai Saleh. Footnote: also known as Kumbai Kumbai. Likewise, the Zhen is a variation of Zhen. End of footnote. And Dejen. The world-renowned University of Sankore was at Timbuktu, north of Ghana. All this and much more passed away like a dream. What happened? This was a great civilization. What happened to it? The country and its capital was visited by the great Arab geographer El-Bekri sometime after 960 AD. He described a vast country of fertile fields with rivers and lakes, woods and green plains, of busy villages, towns, and cities of stone. Yet, when Bonel de Mézières visited the city in 1914, all he saw at first was a level wasteland of rocks and sand as far as the eye could see. What happened to the city of stone? Where were the green fields, the green trees? Where were lakes? And above all, what became of the great Wagadu River that flowed near the capital? How could any of these things ever have been true? If there is any such thing as the unbelievable, here it was. Yet, oral history insisted that this was the area where Ghana's ancient capital city once stood. So, digging unbelievably, the excavators finally reached and began to unearth the city that had been entombed by the desert sands for centuries, and the very idea that it ever existed had almost been forgotten. Here then, buried under tons of sand, was the answer to one of the greatest riddles of history. To understand it is to understand one of the most powerful forces in the decline of African civilization, and why so many of the continent's famine-crazed people sank into barbarism and the life of savages. The fall of Ghana's empire was merely a prologue to the fate of the still greater empires of Malai and Songhai, that later spread over much of the same area and beyond. The culmination of the process of disintegration was being slowly reached in each of these countries, even while they were expanding over vast areas. Flushed with all the glories of wealth and power, we might here observe that nearly 1,000 years later, the illusion that bigness, wealth, and military power are sufficient to guarantee security and permanence still persists. Indeed, power and wealth tend to make rulers both obstinate and blind in the face of obviously undermining forces. The destruction of the capital by the Muslims in 1076 and the Great Migration from the country are part of the story, but only a part, because the Muslims did not stay in force. This invasion was simply another major factor in the process of slow disintegration and expedited it. It certainly stepped up the mass flights of Ghanaians southward into the forest and to the coast. A second factor that affected the stability and growth of the country was the continuous raids by the Semitic nomads of the desert. Bear in mind that some of the attacking nomads were tributary subjects, mostly Berbers and Arabs. Footnote: a reminder, Berbers and Arabs generally included black Africans, Afro-Berbers, and Afro-Arabs, all converted to Islam. The most fanatical Muslims were often the blacks and mulattoes. End of footnote. The aims were booty and destruction, not conquest and settlement. The desert people hated settled, civilized life, regarding it as feminine. The raiders appeared suddenly in surprise attacks and disappeared as suddenly. Settled communities were deserted and migrations developed en masse. The refugee movements within the country created internal tensions and conflicts, while movements from the country further weakened it. A chain reaction set in, and some of the internal causes of conflict and disintegration may be noted as follows. 1. Dissatisfaction with a central government that tended progressively to undermine the traditional constitutions of both the parent nuclear state and of the formerly independent states, which now made up the empire. 2. The desire for independence on the part of these states, or more security in an alliance with some other seemingly rising power, such as Malai. 3. Hard times. Drought leading to famine was becoming more frequent, almost a permanent condition. Farming, the occupation of the masses, was becoming too difficult to support life as the soil itself was dying. 4. The decline of trade. Stepped up Arab-Berber raids on caravan trails, the lifeline of the empire. 5. Failure to capture Wangara gold mines, leaving the state in the now precarious position of a dependent middleman. 6. Civil strife over successions to the throne. The ruling class had become Muslim, introducing revolutionary changes in traditional constitutional practices. 7. Weak leaders on both local and national levels. Wisdom, courage, and ability were no longer tests for high office. 8. Religious conflicts. Muslim kings versus non-Muslim masses. This meant war on time-honored religious beliefs and practices. The African masses, of course, were regarded as infidels, but the ruthless program of forced conversions to Islam failed as more and more of the people fled the country. Islam eventually triumphed over this whole area, which is today what was French West Africa. 9. The increasing death of the soil. Deforestation, erosion, and the uninhibited southward movement of the Sahara. The gradual drying up of streams and sinking of lakes and rivers were death knells for a civilization that was already decaying for reasons which I have just outlined. 10. Changes in climate. The quick evaporation of rainfall, leaving the soil as dry and thirsty as ever. Maurice Delafosse, in his Negroes of Africa, declared, "The region where Kumbai was built is now very arid. In truth, it rains here every year, but there are now new rivers, and except at a few points where pools and sheets of not very deep subterranean water exist, the vegetation, although fairly thick in spots, is reduced to thin pasturage, gum trees and other spiny bushes. Halligan. The region contains no villages, and is traversed only by nomadic Moors and hunters of the Namadi. But very numerous and extended traces of former habitations and burial places which turn up at every instant show that the country was formerly inhabited, in part at least, by sedentary peoples, and lead us to suppose that it was better watered than it is today, and more suitable for tillage. Besides, Beckery speaks of vast and prosperous fields which extended to the east of Ghana. The capital city and local traditions are unanimous in attributing the decline of the kingdom and the dispersion of its inhabitants to the drying up of the Wagadu and consequent famine. This early conclusion by Delafosse with regard to the reason for the disappearance of one highly civilized African state has not only been confirmed by later investigations, but the same major factors explain the collapse of other African states. Malai. Malai was the second of the great three West African empires that became well known in the medieval world. Although its history has been traced back to Paleolithic times through rock paintings, carvings, and other archaeological finds, such as the Ashilerman in 1927, the empire rose in the 13th century with the decline of Ghana. Kangoba was the small kingdom of the Mandinka people on the southern border of Ghana near the mouth of the Niger River. It was a tributary state and held the strategic trading position of dominance over the gold mines of both Wangara and Bore. Among the contestants for succession to the disintegrating empire of Ghana were two of its rebelling provinces, Kaniaga and Diara. These were overcome by the nearby kingdom of Tegrur under the leadership of Sumen Guru, who succeeded in capturing the capital of Ghana, Kumbai Saleh, in 1203. He undertook the task of rebuilding the empire, proved to be unequal to it, and was defeated by the Mandinka king Sundiata at the historic battle of Karina in 1240. The battle's outcome was the beginning of the Malayan Empire. Under the emperors Sundiata Keita and Mansa Uli, there was systematic reorganization and consolidation of the former empire and expansion beyond it, so that when Mansa Musa came to the throne in 1312, he had a solid foundation upon which to build what was to become one of the greatest empires of the time, and to be recognized as such around the world. But two things should be noted here. The first is that both Ghana and Malai included strong Arab-Berber tribal states under their rule. Most of these were united desert societies. They occupied the surrounding strategic points of power. They were able to harass and raid the great caravans conducting the vast import and export trade of the black states across the Sahara. The armed escort guards were powerless against them because they could throw a mile-long caravan into disarray and confusion by the tactics of sudden attack and withdrawal, until the heavily laden fleets were at their mercy. These caravan trails, the lifelines of empires, were regularly under attack or threatened. One solution of the problem, it was believed, was for black kings to become Muslims. Embracing Islam became not merely a policy of expediency wherever Arab and Berber Muslims gained a dominant foothold in black Africa, but it became a compelling means to economic survival. The Muslims not only controlled the all-important caravan trails, but all African ports of trades with the world. The fact that many of the desert tribes were nominally a part of the empire or tributaries to it made matters worse. Pretending to be loyal to the emperor when this served their purpose, they could play it both ways. They therefore always had their separate communities in the capital city and all important trading towns. As Muslim brothers, they secured important posts in the government. Protected caravans moved unmolested. What it means is that the loyal Arabs, as advisors to the king, were in a position to collect tribute from him to pay off potential raiders. Here, as elsewhere, brotherhood and integration were most beneficial for the whites, even when they were in a politically subordinate status. The second important fact to be noted is that the Arab-Berber position near and within the empire was the base from which the fanatical Almoravids spread the Islamic religion in West Africa with an uncompromising aggressiveness unmatched in the history of religion. Their proselytizing brotherhoods were camps of militant missionaries. They were hostile to the black masses because the masses actively resisted conversion to Islam. Here again may be an example of why so many Africans, and especially Afro-Americans, think of Arab as colored people, for the well-known Almoravids were indeed predominantly mulatto. Strong black Muslim kings protected their people. Baran Mindana was the first Mansa king of Malai to embrace Islam in 1050 AD. He urged that all succeeding Mansas do the same. Arabic historians therefore list him as the first king of Malai. The history of the country began with Islam and the pilgrimages to Mecca, another aspect of the blackout. The emperor kings who came after Baran Mindana did indeed become Muslims, mainly for reasons mentioned above. Some became as fanatic as any of the semi-barbarous Almoravids of the deserts. Such was the great Marijalik, known to fame as Mansa Musa. It appears that his driving ambition was to be known worldwide as the greatest black Muslim in all Africa. He succeeded, and it paid off on all fronts except among the masses of common people. International trade now moved freely in all directions over the caravan trails. Between 1307 and 1332, Malai evolved from an expanding kingdom to an expanding empire. It extended north over the desert, extending its authority over the all-important salt mines of Taghaza. Eastward, it reached the Hausa states of Nigeria, and westward, it covered the strong Tigray and the countries of the Fulani, Afro-Berber, and Tukulura peoples. The remarkable expansion of Malai meant the remarkable expansion of Islam in the western Sudan and in countries outside of the empire. The spread of Islam replaced African traditional laws. The Quran was now the constitution. All this made for increased internal discord, rebellions by conquered groups, and migrations from the country. Here we have to remind ourselves that we cannot have it both ways. Many of the black kingdoms and empires about which we sing with pride became great by riding roughshod over another black state and people, and thus sowing even more seeds of hate to grow among black generations still unborn. The decline did not begin until after 1400, when, under weaker successors, the Ghana story of internal disunity and strife repeated itself. After 1550, Malai as an empire was little more than an inspiring memory. There followed the usual array of numerous small and independent states, each ripe for easy conquest by a stronger power. Islam was that power. It continued to spread as various black rulers followed the example of Mansa Musa and became Muslims. Just as Malai had spread over the former Ghana Empire, Songhai was to spread over Malai. Songhai. It is almost like retelling the story of Ghana and Malai. The Songhai people were the nuclear group that was to build their name to the greatest African empire of the 15th and 16th centuries. Their small state, with its capital at Kukya, was east of the Niger River bend between Gao and Agadez. Its history under a long line of Diaz, kings, can be traced back to the 7th century. The 16th ruler, Dia Kasoi, was crowned at Gao early in the 11th century, and the capital moved there. The capture of that city-state from the Sorko people in the 7th century was the early beginning of Songhai expansion. The Songhai were one of those unique peoples who as a whole can be characterized as highly intelligent, industrious, and aggressively invincible, both as traders and warriors. With the capture of Gao, their success was assured, for this was the important caravan center for international trade. It dominated the commerce of the central regions of the Western Sudan, controlling the flow of gold and ivory from the southern forest and the precious salt trade from the Taghaza mines in the northern desert. This was an intolerable situation for the still powerful Malai. Therefore, in 1325, Mansa Musa sent several divisions under his ablest generals to bring Gao and other Songhai territories within the empire. The defeated Songhai pretended loyalty and wholehearted allegiance to the Malai Empire while busily rebuilding and reorganizing their armies and political structure. They discontinued the rule of the Diaz in 1335 and started a new leadership with the kingly title of Sunni. The second Sunni of the new line, Suleiman Mat, was able to break away from Malai and declare Gao independence in 1375, just 50 years after being under the empire's rule. There followed a long period of relative calm and inaction. The record indicates that the fortunes of the nation rose or fell according to the character of the leadership. So it was that rapid expansion in all directions was resumed when Sunni Ali, perhaps the greatest of Songhai emperors, came to the throne in 1464. He became a nominal Muslim for the same economic reasons that influenced other black kings. The Muslims not only controlled trade with Asia and Europe, but they also dominated trading activities in towns and cities through resident merchants. The wealth of the nation depended very largely on cooperation with them. The African people, on the other hand, were generally anti-Islam. The problem of all African kings was how to be a Muslim without alienating the people. Sunni Ali was powerful enough to play it both ways. It became clear to the Arabs and Berbers that his real loyalty was to the traditional religion of the Africans. They never forgave him. However, at the close of his 35 years of leadership as a great general and statesman in 1492, the Songhai Empire rivaled that of Malai in wealth and territorial expansion. The two principal seats of learning, Timbuktu and Jenne, had been included in Songhai's northward and westward sweep. It was at Timbuktu that two of the great African writers of the period wrote their famous histories in Arabic: Tariq al-Fatash by Mahmud Kati and Tariq al-Sudan by Rahman al-Sadi. The most famous African scholar during this period of Songhai's intellectual flowering was the biographer and lexicographer Ahmad Babo. Footnote: some writers, including E.W. Boyle, classify him as Berber or Afro-Berber. End of footnote. Born in 1526, they all wrote in Arabic, just as black Americans all write in English, and for the same reasons. The Black Revival of Learning. Songhai's greatness was due to something more than the remarkable expansion of its empire over a territory larger than the continent of Europe. That was great, but greater by far was the grand scale on which the revival of learning spread among the blacks of West Africa, the Western Sudan, or land of the blacks. Three of the principal centers of learning were at Jenne, Galle, and Timbuktu. At the head of the educational system at Timbuktu was the world-famous University of Sankore, drawing students from all Western Africa and scholars from different foreign countries. It was especially noted for its high standard of scholarship and therefore exacting admission requirements, about which there were some complaints. The university structure consisted of 1. Faculty of Law, 2. Medicine and Surgery, 3. Letters, 4. Grammar, 5. Geography, and 6. Art. Here, art had to do with such practical training as manufacturing, building, and other allied crafts. After the basic training, the expertise required was through the traditional apprenticeship system in the various craft guilds. There were thousands of students from all parts of West Africa and other regions. We have no record of the exact number. The accounts also mention the large number of scientists, doctors, lawyers, and other scholars at the university without giving the exact number, perhaps not considered necessary in the 15th and 16th centuries. And there is something else that simply had to exist underneath this university system for which there is no record, account, or even a passing reference. This was the West African elementary and secondary school system, without which there could not have been a University of Sankore with such high standards for admission. As we have shown, the Muslim religion and its Arabic language had spread over much of West Africa and had been embraced particularly by black rulers, notables, and merchants, along with the immediate followers of all of these. The masses held on to the African religion, although thousands of these also found it expedient to pass as Muslims in towns and cities. The Arabic language, unlike any other in the world, had a three-way advantage in its spread. Like Latin in Europe, at the time, it was the language of religion and learning. But unlike Latin, Arabic was also the language of trade and commerce. This last use made it more widespread among the blacks than it would have been otherwise. Arabic, therefore, was the language used by black scholars in West Africa, whether they were Muslims or not. But the study of the Islamic Quran, law, and literature was at the core of the university's curriculum, and all this made the widespread revival of learning in Africa appear to be an entirely Muslim affair. The fact is that the thirst for learning was so compelling that the introduction of any written language after the loss of their own native writing was welcomed as a godsend. To be able not only to read and write again, but also to advance to higher education was far more important to Africans than the vehicles of religion as media, whether Muslim or Christian in orientation. For the Muslim and Christian missionaries, religion was the main objective, but for most Africans, education was the main objective. It may not be without significance that the Renaissance in Africa occurred at the same time it developed in Europe, between the 15th and 16th centuries, and that both in Europe and Africa, Islamic sources were the catalyst. For the Arabs, like the early Greeks, had advanced their civilization by systematically drawing heavily on the cultures of pre-existing civilizations with which they came in contact as they spread out from the deserts of Arabia to distant lands. They enriched and expanded their own language in a well-organized enterprise in copying the most important literature they could find. The most important classical manuscripts had disappeared from Europe entirely during the so-called Dark Ages. The only sources extant were those copied and preserved by the Arabs, and without which, scholars generally agree, the great European Renaissance could not have occurred. In this region of Africa, as elsewhere wherever Asian and European influence prevailed, the destruction of black civilization was real, not imaginary. But in this widespread destruction, something was generally missed, enough to give posterity a clear idea of the state of things which were. So of the period, only 3 great black writers escaped the blackout: Mahmud Kati, Rahman Es-Sadi, and Ahmad Babel. Who were the others? Babel, the last black president of the University of Sankore, tried to tell us in his series of biographies. But these too were destroyed along with 40 other works of which he was the author. There seems to be no question at all about Babel being the greatest and most prolific African writer and scholar in the 16th century. Perhaps African should be dropped here, for who else, Asian or European, authored a comprehensive dictionary and 40 other works during this period? His fame as a scholar-educator spread to distant lands. In the Muslim destruction of the Songhai Empire, the main centers of learning with all of their precious libraries and original manuscripts were destroyed first. Then the age-old practice of seizing all men of learning and skilled craftsmen for enslavement and service to the conquerors. Foremost among those captured and carried off to the Maghreb was Ahmad Babel. There he was treated as an honored guest and instructed to use his great learning in the service of his conquerors, the Moors. Now again, just who were the Moors? The answer is very easy. The original Moors, like the original Egyptians, were black Africans. As amalgamation became more and more widespread, only the Berbers, Arabs, and coloreds in the Moroccan territories were called Moors, while the darkest and black-skinned Africans were called Blackamoors. Eventually, black was dropped from Blackamoor. In North Africa and Morocco in particular, all Muslim Arabs, mixed breeds, and Berbers are readily regarded as Moors. The African blacks having had even this name taken from them, must contend for recognition as Moors. We do not know whether Babel continued to write and publish any more books during the remaining years of his captivity in Morocco, as indeed we are ignorant of even the titles of the 40 books he is known to have written. But suppose just 4 or 5 of his works had escaped destruction and came down to us, or even just one. And yet, we are only considering what the African race has lost from just one man, and not the countless others whose very names were erased along with their works. It should be needless to point out in this connection that just as blacks profit from the best works by white scholars, whites can and do profit from the contribution of blacks to the advancement of knowledge. Therefore, the destruction of Babel's works and those of the other blacks was the destruction of an essential part of world civilization. In considering the flowering in learning in West Africa and its brutal interruption by the Moors, certain important facts should stand out because they run through the entire field of black history. The first, and perhaps the most important fact, is that the general enslavement of Africans, proclaimed to the world as savages, began during the very period and in the very West Africa, the center of which held one of the great universities of the world and other colleges. The second important fact is that black Muslims were not spared from destruction by non-black Muslims. The third all-important fact was the non-enslavement of mulattoes and their classification as white, Egyptians, and Moors. This crucial fact must not be glossed over, as it has been throughout our history. First, because there were many tribes or societies in Africa which were exclusively mulatto, to use the term loosely. Nothing was more characteristic of the mixed breed clans, tribes, or societies than their unceasing efforts to emphasize their separate identity and their constant fear of being considered Negroes or black Africans. Hence, their over-anxious crusades or jihads against black states and their spearheading most of the slave raids in Africa. They further emphasized their ethnic difference by always retaining thousands of black slaves in their own service while selling the others. The white man, by driving his offsprings as a wedge into the black race, is not only able to keep it weak by keeping it divided, but he is able to maintain effective control over it without the necessity of his own presence. The most murderous of the mulatto slave traders was Tipu Tib, with his slave empire headquarters on Zanzibar. His slave trails extended in every direction from the east coast far into the interior where white slave traders feared to go. But Tibbs' agents and slave caravan leaders were generally colored like himself. And since black slave armies were always both the backbone and spearhead in European and Arab adventures, the record should be clear in identifying all of the participants in the slave hunting crusades in Africa. There were, therefore, more significant factors in the destruction of this larger-than-Europe Songhai Empire and its advancing educational system than is evident from a summary statement that it was destroyed by the Moors. The Black Muslim Triumph and the End. Sunni Ali was succeeded by Sunni Bahru in 1492. He refused to compromise with Islam at all, defended the African religion, and thereby lost the support of the towns and cities which were the centers of Muslim power. He was deposed after a year, thus paving the way for Sunni Ali's chief minister, greatest general, and most ardent and sincere black Muslim, Muhammad Toure. He became emperor in 1493 with the military title of Askia. He matched Sunni Ali not only by reigning 35 years, but by extending the empire eastward over the Hausa states across northern Nigeria, northward over the Sahara, beyond the Taghaza salt mines, and westward to the Atlantic Ocean. He had earned the name by which he is best known, Askia the Great. At the age of 80, he was deposed by his eldest son in 1528 and died 10 years later. His successors were generally weak and had short reigns. Weak leaders and short reigns led to internal conflicts and social, political, and economic disorganization. These conditions were signals for revolts by conquered states and attacks by others. In 1582, the Hausa states regained independence, and within a few years, the Mossi states renewed their attacks. The Sultan of Morocco, Moulay Ahmad, now saw his opportunity to capture the salt mines of Taghaza and the gold of Songhai. Armed with guns and cannons, then unavailable to African armies, the Moroccans met the army of Songhai under Askia Isiaq at Tondibi, 1594. Spears and arrows had to give way to gunfire. Thereafter, the Songhai forces split up into small units to harass enemy garrisons and outposts in surprise attacks. These attempts to dislodge the invaders lasted over 70 years, but the Songhai of glorious memory was no more. The armies of Islam continued their triumphant march in Africa, destroying its basic institutions wherever they could do so. The remarkable Mossi. They never called it an empire. They called it the Mossi states. We let it go at that. But it was in fact an empire if the same definition is applied as it is in other areas of the world. It was a union of kingdoms, similar to other core groups, whose expansionist proclivities create empires. It differed markedly in the pattern of centralized authority. The traditional African political system of local autonomy was maintained in the independence of the individual states that made up the empire. There were 5 core kingdoms: Ouagadougou, Yatenga, Fada-Gurma, Mamprusi, and Dogamba. Each had become a kingdom independently of the others, each as powerful as the other. Therefore, the union of these states was inspired by the bonds of kinship, a common Mossi origin. Although located southward between the great arms of the Niger River and almost surrounded by the expanding empires of Malai and Songhai, neither was able to subdue and bring the Mossi within their empire. Quite the contrary, with the greatest and most dashing cavalry forces in Africa, the Mossi carried the war to them. The Mossi nation is another case study because it is also a typical example of migrating blacks who united to form new and larger political entities, conquered the people whose homeland they invaded, and at the same time showed wide cultural variations while holding steadfastly to the fundamentals of African constitutional principles. They were reflected not only in the political organization of African states, but also in the conqueror's respect for the land rights of those whose original homeland it was. In short, the rights of conquest did not include ownership of the land, a fundamental constitutional principle. I have emphasized the difference between two main types of migrations: the slow and almost leisurely movements of people over countless centuries because of the no longer tolerable conditions of climate and soil, and the stepped-up migrations amounting to refugee flights because of increasing invasions from Asia and Europe. It is these latter causes with which we are now dealing. They increased as the Arabs overran the eastern Sudan and became a period of crisis between the 12th and 17th centuries. This was the long period during which migrating blacks undertook to form new and stronger states all over the continent, and succeeded, while other refugee blacks found themselves in areas where just to survive at all required all the energy they could muster from day to day. Progress? What progress? How progress? Blessed, then, were the migrants who, unlike those, found territories where progress was possible. Blessed were the Mossi. By 1500, they had become a dominant power and one of the most industrious nations of the period. Africa-wide concept of the basis for legitimate rule was held to as a means of social control and national unification, as well as the basis for all authority, high or low. As elsewhere, it all traced back to the founders of the nation. In this case, Wodreogo and Wobre. They had the Nam, the God-given power to lead men. All of their descendants should inherit this power and therefore inherit the right to rule. Implicit in this, or certainly in the ideas developed from it, was the right to conquer and rule. The idea of royalty evolved from the same source, further illustrating how a fact and a commendable idea, such as honoring the founders of a nation, may be elaborated through time to a grand old myth. But in Mossi land, the Nam seems to have been carried to extremes. Everyone seeking recognition or even a minor office claimed to have the Nam. This bestowed the title of Naba, ruler so-and-so. The extent to which the political structure was based upon the Nam made Mossi society somewhat unique among African states. Since the Nabas of the 5 core states claimed equality and were all fiercely independent in both spirit and action, the early contests were over what state should become the leader of them all and provide the Mogho Naba, king of kings. Ouagadougou finally won. Although it was not senior in the Nam line of descent, it won because it had become the center of economic activity and therefore national prosperity, and because the Ouagadougou people outdid themselves in screaming praise and praise songs for their Naba, who was the ruler of the whole world. His dominions were boundless. He was God's son, and therefore sacred. No one must look upon his face. All must prostrate themselves before him. Supreme justice can be found only in our Mogho Naba, all of which was too much for the other states to overcome. The Ouagadougou Naba thus became the Mogho Naba of the United Mossi Kingdoms, principalities and chiefdoms, each of which was virtually autonomous. The Mogho Naba had no real authority outside his own Ouagadougou kingdom. Unity was achieved through negotiations, friendly persuasion, or, all else failing, sometimes by force of arms. More national unity seems to have been achieved, however, because the various states voluntarily followed the successful example of Ouagadougou in social, economic, and political organization, and the ritualistic splendor of a court that claimed rulership of the world. The political structure did not vary from the traditional African constitutional system. The village chief and council, district chief, Naba, and council, province governor, Naba and council, and Magho Naba and council. The Woidi Naba, prime minister, was next in authority under the Magho Naba. Each important minister in the national government was also the Naba, governor, of a province, another variation from traditional practice. There were other variations. Some were highly important. One was the minister of Muslims. For, unlike so many other African societies, the migrating Mossi had learned something from the history of the blacks in their relations with Arab and Berber peoples. No foreigners could settle in Mossi territory, but since the Mossi themselves were great traders, they needed the far-flung outlets which the Muslims everywhere controlled. Muslim traders were therefore admitted into the country under the strict supervision of the Ministry for Muslims. All Muslim activity was restricted to trade. The religion of Islam was rejected, its teaching or conversions to it forbidden. In short, the Mossi saw Islam and Christianity as the white man's vehicles of conquest. It was the only black nation to see this in time. Indeed, Mossi prophecy held that when the first white man appeared in the land, the nation would die. The time had not yet arrived. The Mossi policy of excluding whites or rigidly limiting the number and controlling their activities in the country further illuminates an African experience that is already so clear that it should require no additional light. All African states that began to develop again after the great dispersions, rebuilding and expanding, were prosperous and advancing as black states, as long as they barred the relentless, aggressive whites from their countries, and their destruction became certain only when they abandoned this policy and let the Asians and Europeans in. On this, the record is entirely clear. The Mossi held on steadfastly to their own African religion and African institutions and survived over 500 years, survived into the 20th century until it was finally overrun by France. A few more of these all-African institutions should be mentioned to further frustrate the external influence school. We are dealing with a land and a people where a white face would have been a curiosity, and white influence, even under the disguise of religion, was barred by law. Few things could be more remarkable in the history of the black people than the rigid adherence to a body of principles that indicates a humane and spiritual level of advancement that pointed the direction to real civilization. One of these reflected in the Mossi conquerors' recognition of the principle that no matter how powerful the conquerors of a territory might be, the land belonged to the people whose homeland it was. They were recognized as the rightful owners of the land, and therefore negotiations for settlement of newcomers were carried on with the chiefs or priests of the earth, who represented the indigenous people. Their political system, highly democratic, was unsurpassed by any state anywhere in the world. That system was developed by Africans. The family was the smallest socio-economic and political unit. The extended family council, for example, settled all cases involving offenses by members which affected only the family or were not serious enough to be carried to the village courts. Bad behavior by one member was a reflection on the rest of the family. The Western creed of fierce individualism had no place in this society. What one did was either a credit to his family or a dishonor. Footnote: even the author is annoyed by the number of inescapable repetitions which occur in any comparative study of a representative sample of societies or states, where the focus is on the common origin, sameness, and universality of all basic institution. The description of these, state by state, means repetition after repetition. End the footnote. The village was the next political unit, with an elected headman and a council of elders. The elders were the representatives of the various family sections or wards that made up the village. The village council was the center of authority, subject to the will of the community. The districts were the next and larger divisions, varying in size and having many villages and towns. The district Naba, chief, was a very important official. Any number of districts made up the provinces and kingdoms which formed the nation. The great Nanamse, plural for Naba, headed provinces and kingdoms. All had governing councils. All from the village chief to the king of kings, Magho Naba, were elected by their respective councils and subject to their will. This latter fact was generally well disguised by ceremonial phraseology, ritual, and autocratic sounding decrees from the throne. Indeed, it was a general practice for both the council ministers and the people to proclaim that the Magho Naba has all power, is the most powerful king in all the world, over which he rules. These fictions seem to be one of the delights of the people. For did not these same fantastic claims help to make the Wagadugu Naba the Magho Naba? Indeed, during the periods African societies were most democratic, every effort seems to have been made to make it appear that the supreme power was exercised by the rulers, never by the people. Upon the death or removal of the Magho Naba, for example, there was the constitutional fiction that his successor must be chosen by the Widi Naba, prime minister, and the Widi Naba made the public proclamation with all the ceremonial pomp and splendid ostentation befitting one charged with such an awesome responsibility as that of naming the next emperor. Yet everyone knew very well that the Widi Naba was merely announcing an election that had already been made by the Council of State. In addition to these councils on various local levels, the Mossi developed another way of controlling the behavior of rulers. This was the practice of moving from one unsatisfactory village or district to a more favorable one. Whole villages might move from one district to another. No district chief could afford this direct reflection on his ability to keep the people. Footnote: an African leader's oath to keep the people meant protecting and promoting the welfare of the people. End of footnote. The most important of his inauguration oaths, it also tended to undermine the economy of his area. The question of absolutism in traditional Africa is interesting because it so often means the very opposite of what is understood by the term in Asia and the West. In 7 Different societies covered in my field studies in different regions all declared that their traditional kings had absolute powers as rulers. Follow-up analysis revealed that what was meant was that the chiefs or kings had absolute power to carry out the clearly understood will of the people, which of course is a far cry from self-assumed absolutism. There was no absolutism in Western terms. Even Shaka of the great Zulu Empire complained because the council failed to check him in his excesses. He expected some control and guidance. This control was not attempted by a council overawed by his greatness as a leader. As indicated elsewhere, my studies show that factors such as the Zululand situation helped to explain the decline of ancient African democratic systems. Asia and Europe were not responsible for everything that happened adversely. The Mossi became the outstanding horse breeding country. The finest, swiftest breeds became their specialty. It was probably from this fact that they had dashing cavalry forces that so often carried them to victory and protected their land from conquest for over 500 years. There was a great outside demand for Maasai horses and donkeys. These became an important factor in one of the most economically advanced countries in Africa. We turn next to their economic enterprise and the prosperity that flowed from it as still another illustration of what black people can do on their own initiative without the aid of or even having seen a white man. It was a basically farming society. A superficial or even a non-expert look at the reddish-brown soil would lead one to think that this would or could not be a land for a flourishing agriculture. It gave the lie to my description of what in appearance seemed to be unproductive land in other parts of the continent, hard brown soil robbed of its topsoil and moisture. Here in the Maasai states, just about everything grew: cotton, millet, wheat, corn, peppers, yams, rice, peanuts, cola nuts, onions, tobacco, etc. Their industries included tanning, fine leatherworks, cloth making, basketry, straw hats, iron, lead and antimony, and copperware, mats, jars, pots, pans, soap, and dried fish. All of this production meant that the 6 caravan routes that crisscrossed the country were the highways for a thriving export and import trade. They imported salt, coffee, tea, perfumes, carpets, fine robes, and other things needed, such as needles, which they themselves did not produce. Cotton and cotton cloth seemed to lead in the Maasai export trade for a very long time. Honey was also an important part of the market trade, but I do not know whether it was found wild in abundance or was derived from a cultivated beehive industry. Footnote: I received conflicting answers to this question. End of footnote. There were taxes levied on all trading transactions, on caravan transports through the country to other lands, and on foreign traders in the local markets throughout the country. The people paid an income tax in the form of a percentage of farm produce at harvest time or other commodities. The Europeans had been hearing about this prosperous land that barred the whites from entering since the 15th century. Attempts had been made by various European travelers and traders to get inside this interior country for several centuries, all without success. Some sought permission just to pass through, but again without success. Even the usual white strategy of contacting and forming friendly relations with possible heirs to the throne and dissident factions did not succeed. Even though Arabs and Europeans were increasingly based in all the surrounding countries during the 19th century. It was during the 19th century, however, that the Mossi exclusion of foreigners became less rigid, and there began a gradual relaxation of restrictions, especially of Muslim traders. Some were allowed to settle, and while it is true that the vanguard were black Muslims from the now wholly Islamized neighboring black states, they paved the way and made it smoother for their white Muslim brothers. Moreover, an increasing number of young, modern Maasai leaders began to consider the age-old policy of excluding whites as unenlightened, if not downright uncivilized. What did a great military power, the greatest in Africa, have to fear from a few white faces in the land? But what about the great prophecy, the prophecy that when the first white man appeared in the land, the nation would die? Nothing in Maasai land was better known and more universally believed than this prophecy. It was backed up because early Africans regarded white as evil in itself. Still, the young moderns could declare the prophecy to be just another old saying, manifestly untrue, because some Arabs had been admitted into the country long ago and the nation still lived stronger than ever. So it seemed. Meanwhile, Europeans were closing in on the continent and had the Maasai states surrounded, the British on the Gold Coast and in Ashanti to the south, the Germans next door in Togoland, while the French were pressing down from the north and the Ivory Coast on the west. All had their agents busily gathering as much data as they could about this powerful and overly proud black nation. At first, these agents had to operate from the outside. Dupuy from Ashanti, Coel from Sierra Leone, and Kraus from Togoland. There were many others. Kraus, a German in Togoland, was supposed to be the first European to slip into the country with a caravan. The great prophecy was now about to be fulfilled, almost precisely. The first white European had entered the country. The next white man came in boldly in 1888, backed by the supreme powers of the French Empire, albeit called a republic. This emissary of conquest was Louis Benget. He came to place the country under the protection of France. He met a strong leader still ready to fight in the Magho Naba Sanum. He rejected the proffered French protectorate as a ruse for conquest, resented Benget's haughty and disrespectful attitude, and ordered him out of the country at once. The Magho Naba knew that at that very moment German troops were marching toward his borders. Benget's real importance in the history of the African people, however, was his reaffirmation of the white man's unchanging attitude toward the blacks. Said he, "I feel that a white man traveling in this country, whoever he may be, should not prostrate himself before a black king, however powerful the latter may be." He was not expected to do this. It is necessary that a white man should inspire respect and consideration wherever he goes. They should come as masters, as the superior class of the society, and not have to bow their heads before indigenous chiefs to whom They are definitely superior in all respects. Footnote: quoted in E.P. Skinner, The Mossi of the Upper Volta. End of footnote. In short, and in even plainer language, the lowest white scum of Europe, the most depraved, are nevertheless the superiors of the greatest black kings. The Caucasian Creed. It is a creed for destruction and death. Millions have already died for it and because of it. How many millions more? The future holds this secret. Meanwhile, the 1888 German army under von Francois halted at the Mossi border. The great Zongagongos war drums had sounded throughout Mossi land and easily reached the ears of the German forces. They were not fools. The death-defying Mossi armies were as well known as were their industries and flourishing trade. The Germans also knew that the Mossi forces were waiting for them, probably impatiently, under the personal command of the Tansoba himself, Minister of War. One may wonder why von Francois did not realize even before leaving Togoland how foolhardy it would be to invade the country of the Mossi. In any event, he turned his forces back and thus avoided certain annihilation. The fact is that neither of the three great powers contending for Mossi land wanted to risk its forces in armed combat with these blacks. Another stratagem was developed: a war of attrition. Hit these fighting blacks where it would hurt the most. Weaken them within by destroying their great international caravan routes. Throw the country into an economic panic. The British, French, and Germans all participated in the great conspiracy. While the war against Mossi commerce was quietly pushed, the friendly missions to the Mogul Naba went forward, one after another. This was easy now. After the death of Sanum, his weaker and more European-minded brother became Mogul Naba. Had it not been for a stronger and not so trusting council, he would have been taken in more easily. The wide use of black agents, usually mulattoes, continued to be the white man's secret weapon in becoming the masters of the black world. When the blacks were on top, they could pose as loyal members of the black race, as many of them were in fact, or they could, having white blood, ally themselves with the whites and serve their interests. The whites always made this both easy and attractive, not only by emphasizing their superiority by blood, but by giving them better education and economic opportunities than blacks, under constant survival pressures, could ever hope to achieve. This system became worldwide in dividing the race and creating hostile color bars within it. For since the mulattoes had a better education and therefore a higher income than their black half-brothers and sisters, they, like the whites, regarded this superior social and economic status as the index of inherent superiority itself. Here, superiority seemed to be a demonstrated fact of life, not a theory. And that was why the mulatto, or Creole, George Ekem Ferguson from Sierra Leone, now playing the role of a loyal black African, was able not only to reach the Mogul Naba without any trouble, but even to negotiate a treaty on behalf of the British, something that all the Europeans had been unable to do. The internal situation was changing. The fierce spirit of nationalism that diverted the German Togo threat had somehow declined. Now the shadows lengthened. The whites had also been busily building up and training strong black armies. blacks trained to hate, kill, and conquer blacks. Blood of blacks was to sprinkle and further darken the pages of their history. The French were the most efficient in this development. The baffling phenomenon of blacks more readily fighting and dying for the white man's cause than they are for their own. Indeed, Africa was conquered for the whites by the blacks, and thereafter kept under colonial control by black police and black soldiers. Very little white blood was ever spilled. Black troops, small staffs of white officers, and a core group of European soldiers. Instructions were strict and brief. Always use the blacks. Keep European forces in reserve or in the rear. And so it was that in July 1896, a French lieutenant named Voulet and his staff led a strong army of black cavalry and infantry across the Mossi borders to battle their way to Ouagadougou. The last of the great black states in West Africa was now making its last stand under Mago Naba Wobogo, who seemed to grow in courage as his country collapsed all around him. In 1897, the French, unable to secure the surrender of the Mossi leader, who continued to elude them and stage counterattacks, finally appointed a Mago Naba who would serve them. Mossi guerrillas continued the war from the bush year after year, long after all hope for victory was gone. They were fighting on just as though they did not know that the first white man had long since come, and that therefore the nation had died. They fought on because, while their empire passed, the deathless Mossi spirit lived on, in witness whereof their own Mago Naba, the last of the elected line, fought with them side by side from the bush, and never surrendered to France.